Good morning, everyone. A massive welcome to the Council for British Archaeology's Festival of Archaeology Digital Week. Thank you so much for joining us for the first of our events today to kick off the festival. Before we go any further, some top tips. If you've got family in the house watching Netflix or anything, kick them off. You're going to want the best internet connection possible, and ideally don't be sat at the end of the garden. Make sure you're sat close to the point where your device connects to the internet. So to start us off this morning, turn your speakers up because we're going to have an introductory video from Neil, who is the Executive Director of the Council for British Archaeology. I'm going to pop that on now and I'll be back with you in a moment.
Hello, my name's Neil Redfern. I'm the Executive Director of the Council for British Archaeology, and I'd like to use this little opening video of our 29th Annual Festival of Archaeology to introduce you to the week's events. The CBA is so pleased to be hosting this year's event again, especially in these really challenging times where coronavirus has really disrupted all our daily activities. For the CBA, we're really disappointed that we couldn't hold our usual on-the-ground events, but don't worry, these will be taking place this year, but in October, and we hope you'll be able to join us then when we put those events on. For now, we have a whole week of digital activity. Yes, we've gone online. We're really keen to keep archaeology active and out there and people participating. And what we're most encouraged about is just how many volunteers and other archaeological groups have joined us in this week in putting forward an amazing archaeological programme. Head online, go to our festival website at festival.archaeologyuk.org, or you can follow us on social media at Archaeology UK. Get online, see what's going on, get involved. That's our real message here. Anyone can participate in archaeology, in the discussion and debate, and we're really excited to see what you might discover. For us, the festival is always an opportunity to explore different themes around archaeology and how archaeology is relevant to today. So this year's theme, we're actually focusing on climate and the environment. Never has there been such an important topic to think about with the whole climate change debate. But what does archaeology have to do with that? Well, I'm fortunate enough to live in the fantastic city of York, and I've brought you to one place that I really love to come to dwell on and think about climate and the effects of climate change. Behind me on the city walls here, you'll see a plaque that actually lists all the historic floods that have happened to York. And what you can see is York is not new to flooding. This isn't a new phenomenon. It's not something that's just come around in the last 30 years. Although if you look closely, what you will see is most of the marks on this plaque do date from the last 40 years. So something is happening, something is different. If you look at York and York's history and York's story and why it's here, it's entirely about the landscape, the environment that actually existed here. York sits at the confluence of two major rivers, the River Ouse and the River Foss. But more importantly, these two rivers coalesce at the very point where a terminal moraine, that's a huge bank of earth pushed up by the last ice age, cuts across the Vale of York. And it is the intersection of that terminal moraine, that landscape hill, and these rivers that effectively made a crossroads in the landscape, a crossroads where humans could navigate across the Vale of York. And at the very point where the rivers meet, the terminal moraine, that is where the city of York was founded. Its very origin owes everything to climate and environment. How we have then subsequently managed that relationship over the years is really, really important. It's an ongoing relationship. This sign shows York's always flooded. York's always had a reason to be challenged by its rivers. But then it's actually where its prosperity stemmed from. Literally, the prosperity flowed up and down these rivers, and it's at this point that human beings translated that into other material culture. And that's what we as archaeologists study. So this theme's hugely relevant to who we are today, how we make these places we live in relevant, successful, thriving and prosperous. That's what archaeology has to offer, and I hope you'll discover that with us as we go through our festival this week.
well. Great, welcome back. Thank you for joining us. And my name is Sam, and I'm Education and Community Manager at Wessex Archaeology. We're very happy to be hosting this event on behalf of the Council for British Archaeology. Very shortly, I'll be joined by my colleagues Emma and Jenny. But first, I'm going to run you through a few things that will help you make the most of the session. So, first of all, make sure you've got your speakers turned on. That's really helpful. Secondly, throughout the session, you will be able to ask questions. So on your screen, you should have a box that looks a little like this one on your screen at the moment. If you have a question, type it in the box and click send. So we'll briefly test this. I'd like you to rate your knowledge of archaeology on a scale of 1 to 5. There we go. I'd like you to test your knowledge on a scale of 1 to 5. So, in this little box on your screen, type, if you think you're a bit of an expert, give me a number 5, and if you're completely new to archaeology, type the number 1. And I'll give you a moment to see where we are with that. I'm just looking at the results coming in now. Some people are saying where you're from. We've got people in Cumbria. A few pros, that's good. Some people are completely new, fantastic. And it's really useful for us to know this, so we'll make sure we use the right language throughout to make sure everyone knows what we're talking about. But as I say, if at any point you're lost and confused, in that little box, you can also type any questions you have. In the main, we'll answer those questions at the end, but if there's anything personal that comes up, we'll do it as we go along. Brilliant. So the other thing you can do, if you, at the end of the session when we're asking questions, if you feel like I haven't answered your question, you can pop up your hand. And you can do that just by pressing the little hand button in your control panel there that's highlighted in the yellow circle. So if you need to desperately have a question answered, pop your hand up there. Now the other thing you can do, at the top of the webinar window, you have a picture of a camera highlighted in this picture on the left. If you click that camera, you can choose to have the panelists' webcams above or below the slide. And if you click the bar highlighted in the picture on the right, you can make the slides bigger or smaller. So you're completely in control of how big or small your slides are, or where the cameras appear on your screen. Now, before we go any further, we have a special message from a member of staff who I'm sure some of you will recognise. So I'm going to pop that video on, and I'll be back with you in a moment.
It's a funny old world, isn't it, eh? You know, I've been in archaeology now for, what, 50 years. It's a devil of a long time. But actually, there was an organisation, a body, the Council for British Archaeology, the CBA, which has been in archaeology longer than I have. That was set up soon after the war as a voice to promote archaeology. But more than that, it was set up to educate you, the public, in the ways of archaeology. And from those simple beginnings, the whole thing has escalated to the point that we've got now, the Festival of Archaeology, an annual celebration of archaeology in Britain. Now, beyond that remit that the CBA had, it also did something else too. It published this, which was, for an aspiring archaeologist like me, a lifeline to work. It really was. I've got one here from March 1973. I've got a whole series of them, look. And this one here, let me share this with you, because this is really personally important. Here we are. Guess where this is? The second season of research excavation at this Neolithic and Bronze Age industrial (flint mines). Yep, Grimes Graves in Norfolk. That was a seminal dig for a young archaeologist like me. It's where I cut my teeth on flints, literally, and actually learned all about flints. It really did fashion the rest of my career. But beyond that, of course, there's also so many changes in archaeology. One of them is particularly the breakup of disciplines and the detail of disciplines. One of those disciplines is environmental archaeology. Now that's become so much more important in more recent times as we've understood how natural changes occur to our world and how many of them are man-made. And in the early days of Wessex Archaeology, all those bits of environmental work were subcontracted out to specialists, but it gradually developed to such an important point that in 1988, Wessex Archaeology appointed its first ever environmental archaeologist. Since then, the science and the study has expanded to the point now where there are 13 full-time professional environmental archaeologists working at Wessex Archaeology. Let's go and see what they get up to.
Fantastic. So, without further ado, Emma, are you ready to join us?
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Yes, I am. So I'm just going to load up my webcam so you guys can see me. Hello.
Hello.
Lovely. So, yes, I am a commercial archaeologist. I spend most of my time digging up the material, which my colleague Jenny then will go on to process. So as an archaeologist, we want to gather all that information about the past, don't we? And we've got different ways of doing it. So one of the ways we do it is to perhaps look at UAVs, geophysics, but one of the main ways we investigate is to dig and record archaeological features. So in this picture, my colleague, I think that's Phil and actually Cordelia, they're taking out half of the deposits from the pit. The string line that you can perhaps see going across, that's really important as that acts as a guide to keep that all-important section straight. Now, as field archaeologists, we'll look at the section and we'll try and read the deposit, so the different bits of soil, and decipher how that pit was actually filled up and then what it was used for. But we don't stop there. That pit was full of burnt stone and charcoal, but we don't actually know what it did or what it was used for, so we need to find out. So, if you go on to the next slide.
And Emma, I was just going to ask, when we talk about a pit is different to a trench?
Yeah, that's right. So we encounter different features that have different sizes and shapes, and we'll use different words or different terminology to try and make that clear. A trench is something that we'll dig. Often we'll get a big machine and we'll dig a 2 meter by 50 meter long trench, and we'll look at the features in there. The features can be things like pits, so that's a round feature, or perhaps in that one you saw an oval shape, or they can be ditches, and that's much like a ditch that you and I recognise in the countryside, but these ones are filled up.
Cool, thank you.
Lovely. So environmental archaeology can really help us provide with those answers. How does it work? So what they do, they sieve the soil, and small artefacts and even ecofacts remains, and they're revealed. And what we were trying to figure out is how they actually got there. So when our pit was in use, people from the past may use it to dump rubbish in the pit or leftover waste, perhaps from a fire or cooking process. And as that pit became full and then fell out of use, those bits and pieces were covered up and left undisturbed until we've come to excavate them. So those tiny seeds and things like that and bits of charcoal might be too small or too fine for an archaeologist in the field to see, but when it goes to the environmental labs, they'll be able to sift through them and even look under a microscope to reveal those little features. But when we have enough of those pieces of environmental information, we can actually reconstruct entire landscapes as well.
And we've just had a question coming from Gillian. So, and please, everyone, if you use terms that you're not familiar with, do feel free to ask. So Gillian has asked, what is a UAV? So a UAV is an unmanned aerial vehicle, Commonly in the media, you'll hear them referred to as drones. We don't use that word because drones have military connotations, but also drones imply that the flying vehicle is thinking for itself, and ours aren't. Ours are always controlled by a pilot on the ground. So UAVs are unmanned aerial vehicles. Thanks for that, Julian.
Brilliant. So from one site that we had quite recently, we had bones from cows, so loads of different parts of cow bones, nearly 5 kilograms. Now, with all these bones, they had cut marks on them, so we call them butchery or butcher's marks. And some of the animal bones also had bite marks on them. And our specialists were able to look at those bite mark indentations and see that they came from a canine, so a dog. We also found a huge amount of plant remains. We had the environmental team managed to find things like spelt, couch grass, and even sorrel, also some hazelnut seeds. And we also found a fragment of a quernstone. Now, a quernstone is it's a lovely artifact when we do find them. It's this big, huge stone, very, very rough, and we use that to grind down and make flour, basically. So we found a fragment of that quernstone. Now, in the picture you can see with all these lovely kind of C shapes and colours, they actually represent archaeological features from this dig. Just to give you a bit of a background, all those bits of bone, things like that, were found on this site, and the kind of the C shape and round features are round houses. So those lovely round houses that were very common, prevalent in the Iron Age. This site has been dated to the Iron Age as well. And we've also got those long lines coming down. They're part of field boundaries or markers to kind of justify who owns what bit of land. So a bit like I've got a fence down my garden that demarcates my side of the garden from my neighbours. So what we've got here on this site is a small settlement with a little bit of landscape management where they're basically saying, right, this is our farming area, this is our living area. So when we take all these artifacts and ecofacts, so the ecofacts are from what we get from the soil, it tells us about the environment, we put these all together, we can actually reconstruct entire landscapes. So if we go on to the next slide, brilliant. So just from those little bits of nuts and seeds, we've got this. So if you had been able to walk through this settlement, you might have been able to see the spelt growing nearby with those typical countryside weeds like onion couch. It's also called knot or pearl grass. And you've also smelled a very, very sweet hay scent coming from Gallium verum. So that's a bright yellow, frothy blossom flower, commonly known as lady's bedstraw. So lady's bedstraw is quite a ubiquitous plant in history, and even is referenced in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And perhaps as you're walking through, you might have had a chance to eat some hazelnuts, perhaps chew on a bit of sorrel, and then as you were eating that, you might have seen some dogs scavenge from the freshly cut, butchered cattle carcasses across the main housing areas. Now, going back into the heart of the settlement and closer to the houses, there would have been a steady, rough whirring noise coming from the women in the village as they were doing the arduous task of grinding down and milling flour on their rotary quernstones. So this wonderful image, so evocative of kind of farming and settlement life, is really put into place by the ecological artifacts that we gather from those soil samples. So without that, we can't make these sorts of reconstructions.
So I think what we'll do, we'll go behind the scenes and we will see what happens when all these samples get back from site and how we begin to extract the secrets from the soil. So I'm going to pop our next short film on, and if at any point during the film there's any questions you want to ask, by all means stick those in the question box. And before we play the video, there's a couple of questions about which sites we're using. We'll cover that at the end. We'll let you know which sites we've talked about.
Welcome to the Environmental Department at Wessex Archaeology in Salisbury. I'm Jenny, and I'm going to be going through some of the processes today that we go through in order to retrieve the material that we're interested in here, particularly in order to be able to reconstruct the environments in which the people from the past lived. How we're able to do that is that our site staff bring us back buckets of soil from archaeological sites that they work on, and this is what they look like. This sea of buckets here is to do, there's many different sites here, and we know where everything is. We have a database that tells us where everything is, so we can go straight to the site straight away. Each bucket should have at least 3 different numbers, which tells us exactly where that soil sample has come from. So we have the site code, which is usually at the top. We have another set of numbers which are in round brackets, and that tells us the actual deposit, so like the pit fill or the post hole or the layer. And then we have a third number which is in like a diamond, and that is the sample number, so that puts exactly where that sample, where that material has come from. What we do with that is we put it in a tank of water, so we want to get rid of as much soil as possible and just identify what's left. The site that we're working on at the moment is a little bit different in that it's a clay site, and clay is particularly difficult to break down. So what we need is the help of hydrogen peroxide. It helps our fingers, and it also helps to not damage any archaeological material that we might have to put a bit of pressure on with our own fingers. I'll just show you. So this basically is what we get. We can get a lump like this, big solid lump of like clay. That's how it starts. We add hydrogen peroxide. and putting goggles on because it can sting if it gets your skin, if it gets into your eyes. It can be very damaging. So just put a little drop, and you'll see it instantly start to fizz. This is the same, I'll just mix it in a little bit. This is the same sample, so it's a 3 bucket sample of the same number, and this is one that I soaked earlier just to show you the difference. You can see how the bubbles are now, and it's gone a lot more moussey inside. So you've got the solid here, and then this is what happens when we use the peroxide. Okay, this is actually a different sample. So what we do now, if I just talk you through the tank first. We have a tank and we have a bin full of water, and they're both connected by a pump. The pump will then just rotate the water around, so we're recycling the water as much as possible, but after a while we have to empty it out and completely start again. I'm just going to wash this one because I'm using a different sample, so I don't want to contaminate the sample. And now what we need to do is we need to get rid of all the excess soil to see what's left. I'm going to pour this in here. And just mix this up slightly. This is quite a charcoal rich sample, so it's going to get a bit noisy in a minute. I'm just trying to break up any excess soil that the peroxide didn't break down, but it seems to have done a great job. Okay, I'm going to put the pump on now, so it's going to get a little noisy. So it'll bring the water up. So I'm opening the valve, which opens it from here. So what basically is happening is that all the lighter environmental material should float to the top and go into, and we'll catch it here, and this is what we call the flot. Sometimes it's not very helpful and it won't always float by itself, so we need to help it a bit. Yeah, see, this is very charcoal rich, and this is what we call the flot, the stuff that floats. And this is the stuff that we're interested in. I mean, this is obviously charcoal, but like some of the smaller stuff may contain like charred grain, charred seeds, anything like that. It's not something that we can necessarily see with the eye right now, but it's certainly something that we'll be able to identify later. What's left in this tank is the larger stuff like stones and any artefacts like bone, pottery, flint tools, anything like this, and that will get saved as well, and that will go to the our artefact specialists, whereas this stuff will stay here and go to the environmental specialists. That's a brilliant one. Okay. Turn this off. What we do with it then is we will put it into trays and everything will be dried. The environmental material will dry a lot slower than the stuff from the big stuff, the residue here. You may be able to, the label goes in everything, so again we have the 3 numbers and they stay everywhere all the time. This will be folded up and will look like this, and then the stuff from here will go into trays like this, and then they are dried.
Fantastic. Welcome back. Thank you so much for staying with us. So Emma and Jenny is going to join us as well now, and we're going to talk a little bit about preservation. I'm always astounded that organic matter can survive under the ground for so long. So as I understand it, there's 3 types of preservation: carbonised, waterlogged and mineralised. Should we talk a little bit about those things?
Yeah, let's go.
So should we start with carbonised?
Okay, so the carbonised material, it's not quite burnt, but that's how you'll recognise it. So it's partly burnt, so it's not fully combusted, basically, and it just forms like this, like coating around the outside of the actual grain, seed or whatever, and that's what helps it to preserve.
And we'll be taking a look at some carbonised material very shortly. What about waterlogged? And again, this surprises me because we think of things being wet as rotting away. Jenny, how do waterlogged things survive?
So basically in a waterlogged sediment, so it's not just floating around in the water, it has to be in a sediment. And basically what happens there is that there's no oxygen. So it stays wet, the sediment stays wet and there's no oxygen anymore. Well, little oxygen, there's far less oxygen. And basically, so there's no way for the organic material inside to break down, to rot. Yeah, because it's the input of oxygen that helps it to rot down, so it won't happen without that.
And Emma, as a field archaeologist, are there sites you've dug on where it's been more likely you'll find different types of preservation?
Yeah, absolutely. So mentioning the waterlogged stuff, probably one of the best experiences I've had actually as an archaeologist was digging a site out in Anglesey, and we had this very large Roman enclosure ditch. It was a very, very wet clay ditch. So where Jenny mentioned that kind of it can float in that sedimenty deposit where there's lots of, it's quite wet and clay. So as we're digging, we managed to see just these little fingers of hay coming out, and we managed to expose a full a twist of hay, so a faggot of thatch. And when we initially revealed it, it was completely yellow, so it still had its bright colours. And yeah, it was incredible, and it was in a Roman deposit that we had dated through pottery, and it looked like you just could have picked it off the ground recently. So that was an incredible site. Other sites we've had more recently. So there's a big HS2 site in the Midlands, and on one of our sites there, we've got former watercourses and channels. And so in some of the pits, so we've got an early pit alignment. So that's a series of pits in a row often used as a political or landscape division. So in those pit alignment, because they're close to a watercourse, we've actually found kind of peat deposits in there. So that's really interesting, because we thought, what's happening with that landscape and how is it changing? Because the landscape isn't peaty now, but we've got peat deposits in those pits, and also some very nicely bits of preserved pottery. So more research has currently been undertaken on that, but it's really, really interesting to have those different types of preservation on site.
And Emma, by coincidence, we've got Dylan tuning in this morning. He's a native of Anglesey, and the site we were talking about was at the power station.
It was indeed.
And is that Wilfer?
Yes, yeah, Wilfer. Spent quite a bit of my time there. It was an exciting site, because you can see the weather front coming in as you get obliterated by the rain and the wind. But the archaeology was incredible.
And we've got a question from Rose, who's 8 years old. Rose is asking about how strong the hydrogen peroxide is. Rose, you might also have heard it called bleach. We use it for cleaning, we use it for making sure things, it's very good at destroying bacteria. The concentration we use is much, much stronger than is ever used in hairdressers. It's also used for dyeing hair, but what we use is much, much stronger, because the clay is so thick, it has to really break it down. And as Jenny showed you in the video, it bubbles away there, doesn't it, Jenny?
It certainly does. Yeah.
Bubbles away. So the third type of preservation then, mineralised. Jenny, what's mineralised?
So it's where the organic content of is not there anymore. It's been completely replaced by minerals. So like in things, you know, that could be a little bit yucky, like poo or something like that, that like it wouldn't be disgusting, it wouldn't be wet, it wouldn't be gloopy anymore, it wouldn't smell, because all the horrible stuff has been replaced by minerals. Yeah.
And you'll all be very excited to know that we will be looking at some poo very shortly. And we have another question just about cross-contamination. Jenny, do you have to be careful when you're processing that you don't get modern seeds and bits of pollen dropping into buckets? Is that ever a problem?
It does happen, yeah. And one of the things that we like, if you get like a modern seed or something in there, you'll see it, because it will be brown and it will look like how you see it now, whereas we know that it'll only be preserved by these methods. So some of them will be very identifiable. Other things like insects, for instance, they're largely intrusive. So a lot of time when you do find it like an insect or something in a sample, it will, like, very large proportion of the time they will be intrusive, but that's what our specialists will be able to tell you. But you do get cross-contamination like that, yeah.
But in the results, we can tease that out by looking at the state of preservation of the insect or pollen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Marvellous. So what I'm going to do now is pop on our next video, and we're going to have a look at what happens after Jenny's done the wet processing, what happens when all that material goes into the lab. So we'll turn our cameras off, and I'll pop that video on now.
So we're going to go inside now. I'm going to put this in the oven. I'm going to put this on a plate where there's a lot more air so it doesn't dry as quickly. Okay. What goes on here? Yeah, so this is like very cool. It's almost like ambient, so because it can distort the stuff that we're actually looking for if it goes too hot. So that's why we do it on a cooler temperature. So you'll recognise these trays from what we've just put in the oven. So this is the larger, and we have smaller stuff. The reason we do that, we separate the sizes outside, is just so it's easier at this stage to be able to sort it. So as I said, outside, what we're looking for here is anything like artefacts, like pottery, which we have here, which is lovely, because not all sites give us an awful lot of stuff, but this is pottery. You can see the very rough inclusions in it. More pottery. Oh, we've got a bit of bone. So that looks burnt. You can see the white. That's burnt. That's probably more like fired clay than pottery. You can see it's slightly different in that it doesn't have all the white inclusions that the pottery has. Yeah, so we take these out, we keep them aside. And you find, and anything else which has no archaeological significance, we throw away, but we weigh it first. So everything like this stone or fired clay there, we weigh it. Okay. Then the stuff that's underneath, we sort again, but we put it through a sieve this time, and the requirements of the project say that this should go through a 4mm sieve. So everything above 4mm we sort. Everything below 4mm we don't sort right now. So put it in the sieve. So this is 4mm on top, and then there's a sieve underneath which is 1mm. So anything between 4 and 1 we won't sort right now, and then the one on the bottom is just a tray to catch any crumbs. And then we empty this out. Everything's out. And we just do exactly the same here as we did with the larger stuff. We can see this is burnt bone again. We also look for any of the environmental material that hasn't floated. So it doesn't always float, not all of it. So we can see there are bits here. So we'll keep that aside. And we as well, yeah, so we've got bone, we've got little bits of pottery again, and we just keep them to the side. The environmental material, we'll add this to the jar. So once this is dry, again it will be put in a jar, and those same 3 numbers there again, so we know exactly where everything has come from. The stuff that we found in here will be added to this, and then this will go to the specialists. Okay, so the stuff that was collected in the 1mm sieve, this is the stuff that we will keep for later on. Depending on the requirements of the job and what we actually find in the flot, then we'll go into here to find any more environmental material. And that, because it's so small, will go under a microscope. So again, we will just put it under. What's here? Yeah, there's a lot of, oh, hello. A lot of stuff in here. Pick it out. Again, these will go into little jars, and they'll go into a bag along with the flot, and it will go to the specialist, because they'll be able to identify what actually everything is and what that says about the environment in the past. In previous sites, we've actually found some amazing things. There's a site from Wales here, and in here we've got lots of chaff, so the bits of wheat you can see here, burnt, well, carbonised, not quite burnt, but we're getting little bits like this. So we don't always get the whole bit, we just get fragments of, so you'll find bits like this in there. Almost looks like a little bit of a tooth, but you'll find this little bit, and it's carbonised, and we have that under here for you to see. Meanwhile, yeah, as I say, this is what it will look like. It will go to the specialists, they will identify, and they'll reconstruct past environments. Thanks for coming.
Welcome back. So, We've had a couple of questions whilst the video was playing. Pip was asking, have we ever found flax or silk in their raw state, specifically in Saxon soil? So Pip, the same preservation rules apply to those kind of things as anything else. So if they're in a waterlogged environment, it's possible. Jenny and I had a quick discussion. We were saying how, particularly on metalwork, sometimes you can find organic remains trapped inside rusted metalwork. But later on in the Q&A session, one of our colleagues, Inez, will be here, so she'll be able to go into a bit more depth on that. Now, we've talked a bit about charcoal. Jenny, when you're going through samples, how do you recognise charcoal?
Primarily colour, so you'll see it straight away, like as it floats to the top. But also, it will smear a lot more than other, like, you know, if you get a black stone or something like that, like charcoal will smear. But also the structure, I've just got a bit here actually. So you'll see that, like on a greater level, you'll see like the structure of it. So you probably can't see that very well actually, but you get like lines, so you can see like the grain of the wood, and then you can see like laminations and stuff like that as well. But primarily colour and the smearing at that stage. Yeah.
We'll have a close-up look at some charcoal in a second.
Yeah.
Emma, I know you've been working at one of our HS2 sites in the Midlands. There's been a lot of charcoal, I understand.
Yeah, that's right. So a lot of that charcoal comes from a very, very large feature called a burnt mound. They're one of my favourite feature types, just because they're just weird. So it's when we identify them on site, we will probably see a large kidney bean shaped spread of heat affected and fractured stones and absolutely loads of charcoal. It can be tremendously hard to dig because it's so heavily compressed, but these burnt mounds represent a human process. So someone's come there and they've done that themselves. It's not a natural geological feature. There are a couple of theories, but what we can see depicted in this past environment is a watercourse and then these circular shapes. So these burnt mounds can be circular or that kind of distinctive kidney bean shape. They can range between 10 metres wide up to about 30. Burnt mounds are really, really common in the Midlands, so that tells us something as well. And they are just full, like I said, of that burnt stone and kind of charcoal type material. So in the reconstruction picture, you might want to pick out this fellow walking down to the river, and he's taking those river cobbles. He's going to then heat them up in his fire, and then he's going to do something with them. And this is where there's a bit of debate within the archaeological research community. It could be that they are using those stones to help ferment things. Perhaps they're having bath houses or like hot houses, or perhaps they are trying to make booze, or maybe they're cooking. So whatever it is, those three theories sound quite enticing, but we don't have any definitive evidence just yet. We just have these very enigmatic large features with tons of charcoal left over.
And I think my personal favourite theory is the steam house theory, that these were used for kind of steam and people. Is that possible?
It is possible, yeah. I mean, we often think about people in the past having quite difficult lives because their lifespans were shorter. They were toiling the land. They had to deal with famine, death, war, all those things. And we don't really think there's space for such lovely, leisureable activities. But yeah, it is entirely possible.
Amazing. I always like to think that people who lived so long ago, they weren't so very different from us at all. So thinking of these past environments, we've got a reconstruction on the screen now. This is of a site in the southwest of England, a place called Yatton, a site that we investigated quite recently. We did this reconstruction because we had some really lovely roundhouses on site. Emma, what would it have smelt like walking through a site like this, and how did the environmental evidence tell us what it could have smelt like?
I mean, you probably get cooking smells from the stuff that they were cooking to eat. So I mentioned earlier, you've have on that previous site, we would have had those bits of animal bones and butchery, and at the Yatton site as well, you would have had animal remains, whether that animal had been butchered for eating or perhaps it was a pet as well. So we've got some evidence that they may have had canines, so pet dogs. And in terms of the smell, it will be brought about through the environmental evidence that we would get. So depending on the seeds that we would have. So I mentioned Gallium verum, so lady's bed straw on the other site. that does have that very distinctive hay scent. And for Yatton, depending on what types of seeds and plant remains we would have, be able to build up a picture of that sort of scent. But you've got mud, you've got cooking, you've got people moving. It could be any number of smells going through a village.
And I think it's worth pointing out that whenever we do artistic reconstructions like this, our environmental team work closely with our illustration and art team, because it's environmental evidence that enables us to put in the correct plants and the correct species of plants when we're reconstructing an environment. So we don't just paint trees and plants randomly, we make sure we've got the right thing based on the evidence that we found. Jenny, when you've been going through these samples, what's your favourite ecofact that you've ever seen and handled?
That has got to be waterlogged hazelnuts. Certainly. I was showing you before, you're like in the bucket, when you tip your bucket into the tank, you know, it'll fall out a bit by bit, you know, grain by grain. But with these, that particular sample, it came out in a big like plop, and it just plopped into the tank. And then as I was prizing it open a bit, like a hazelnut would pop up, and then another one would pop up, and then another, and it was absolutely amazing. You don't get them that often, but that was really exciting. And they were very, it was like they'd just fallen off the tree. They were Bronze Age as well, we believe, so like, you know, about 4,000 years old approximately. And they were brown, like they'd just fallen off the tree, but within minutes you could see them turning black as they were oxidizing, you know, in the air. It was incredible. Yet we still got them. We might be able to show you them later on in a job.
We'll see if we can have a look at those later. If you're interested in going a bit deeper into plants and seeds, my colleague Inez this afternoon will be giving a talk at 2 o'clock, and you can sign up for that on the festival website. And yeah, so Inez will be taking you a lot deeper into seeds and plants and at what periods in time all these things were introduced to Britain. So what we're going to do next, oh yes, let's talk about snails. We'll stick our webcams off, and another one of our colleagues is going to tell you about snails and why they're so important for environmental archaeology.
Okay, so the major thing that we do in environmental archaeology is look at past environments, try and recreate past environments and look at how they've changed over time. One of the ways that we can do this is to look at snails. Now, snails are very fussy about where they live, and we can split them into four groups, which are woodland snails, intermediate snails, open country snails, and ones that like to live in rocks and rubble. Now, the way that we can do this is that, say you have a ditch, and you have the ditch cut. You can take a series of small samples going up that ditch, and once they have been processed, and if there's good preservation of snails in there, then we can look at the snails in each one of those little samples and see how the environment might have changed over time as that ditch is filled. So, for example, the samples from the bottom of the ditch will reflect what the environment was like at the time when the ditch was dug. A lot of the time it might just be woodland, so you might have woodland snails at the bottom. Then over time, as the land's been cleared and crops have been grown, then the types of snails that you will see in the section will change. So you might have open country snails, ones that reflect arable land. You might have at the very top rocks and rubble, because there might not be, there's no trees, there might not be any vegetation there. So it's a really, really good way of seeing how that environment has changed over time, and it helps to build up a picture of the site.
Right, everyone, what we're going to do now is I'm going to switch my camera over to a different camera, and I'm going to sprint down the corridor to join Jenny at a social distance in the EnviroLab, and we're going to show you some exciting examples of ecofact. So bear with us one moment. Hello, everyone. There we go. So here we have a selection of ecofacts. in the environmental lab, and we promised to show you some hazelnuts. So Jenny, shall we start with the hazelnuts?
Yeah, so here are the waterlogged ones that I was saying about that were so exciting to us. So if I get a modern hazelnut and show you the difference, you'll see slight size difference, and colour, of course. But you can see the same features. I don't know if you can get the sort of lines. Can you see the lines on there in the same way as with the modern hazelnut? But yeah, but these came out brown originally, just like this, plopped up to the top. So that is a waterlogged hazelnut, 4,000 years old. So proof that waterlogging does work. Okay, do you want to see a charred one? Should we show a charred?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so here's evidence of charred hazelnuts. So this is how we find them mostly. Yeah. And again, all the same features. I need to put my glasses on because I can't see. So yeah, again, you can see that like flattened bit out that we saw on the modern. This must have come from a chalk site because it's a bit white. Yeah, so this is how we find the majority of them. We sometimes get the kernels as well, but largely the shell and fragments of shell.
What about those snails? That's
right.
Plenty of them there.
There certainly are. You want me to open up?
Yeah.
So if you get the camera, you can see tiny, tiny, tiny snails in there as well. Like some of that in there, they are snails. Yeah.
We said we'd show everyone some charcoal. Should we have a look at the?
Okay, so here's the big tray of charcoal that we saw. So this sample, I mean, this is quite unusual, but we do get sometimes like for this, but this is, we had 8 of these trays from a 4 bucket sample. You saw the size of the buckets there, 10 litres outside, and we got 8 trays of charcoal. And I was saying about like the sort of group, the lines that you can see, like the grain, and then you see the sort of laminations there as well as identifiers. Yeah. Okay.
So that would be used for creating heat to cook things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what about some grains and beans? Have you got some?
We certainly do. So we can show you the difference between like modern as well and the ancient ones. This again charred. That's how it survived. But this is a fava bean, or what we know as a broad bean. So we can see, sorry, difference in the size as well.
And that size, as I understand it, that's thousands of years of genetic modification.
Yeah.
The world has more people in it now, therefore we need bigger beans to feed people.
Yeah, and I mean it probably has shriveled a bit over time as well with you know, with the process.
And they're both broad beans.
But they are both, yeah.
So a modern one on the left and an ancient one on the right.
Yeah. Yeah. That is, let me put it back in the right place. Okay, we've got wheat, I believe, as well, which was one of the first. Well, you'll see this. Ines will tell you this later on. Maybe I shouldn't spoil the show. Yeah.
And this is charred wheat.
This is charred wheat again.
And that's the same as what we're looking at here. So this is the bit one we're all familiar with.
Yeah. So this is modern wheat, and this is charred. So you were saying before as well about how do you ever get cross contamination with modern grains and stuff? So you can tell straight away. Well, with this, you know, you'd be able to tell straight away which was modern, which wasn't. Yeah.
Amazing.
There you have this. Put that back.
And then, of course, once everything's been eaten, it goes through our digestive systems, and
we were talking before about mineralised poo.
We were.
So we have some here. It's completely inoffensive.
If you're feeling squeamish on a Saturday morning, maybe look away now.
Okay. So we did have an example. I think it's broken up a bit through time, but yeah, I mean this. You know, it's quite robust. It's not like squishy or anything. It's more like almost like wood or like stone. So there's no smell. There's no, you know, there's nothing offensive about it at all.
it's just been completely replaced by minerals. But we did have an example with that we knew the person perhaps had been eaten. I suppose it could have gone in later on and made an indent in the wet poo sort of thing, like, but we had an imprint of a damson stone, so we can presume that they'd eaten it, but it could have gone in later on and made an imprint.
And how common is it for us to find things like this?
It's not, I mean, we don't find them hugely. I mean, the preservation that we find mostly is charred. Yeah, so I mean, we do find it. It's not completely, you know, out of the ordinary, but it's not the most, the general way that we find things preserved. Yeah, it's usually the charred.
And just another look at those hazelnuts there. How old are we saying those hazelnuts are?
Bronze Age. So the Bronze Age in this country is between, I think, about 2,200 and 700 BC. So somewhere in that period. Yeah, I'm not sure if they it's gone through the process yet, but they are believed to be from a Bronze Age deposit.
Absolutely remarkable to find them.
Yeah, incredible.
And we've got them in a jar of that's water they're in.
It is water.
And they're all right like that.
They're fat, yeah, because if you keep them in the same condition in which they're found, it will preserve it. I mean, we don't like it to be in light for too long, so that will go back into the fridge basically, and it will, if we take any out for like community engagement, we'll wrap them up so they're not exposed to the light for too long.
And it's lovely to see the difference between the waterlogged on the right and then the charred on the left there.
But you know, this is the complete thing as well. You know, it's got the kernel inside.
Kernel inside. Yeah. It's amazing. Fantastic. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to jig back to my office and we're going to have a Q&A session. So this is your chance to ask us questions and we'll be back with you in a second. If you do. So I can see that while I've been away, there's been a lot of questions coming in, which is great. So I'm also going to bring into the conversation my colleague Nez. In 1 second. So Emma, are you there too?
I am, yes. Hello.
I'm just pulling in Inez, who is our lead environmental scientist. Inez, we got you as well.
Hello.
Hello, Inez. Hello.
Hey.
So, thank you for joining us. Now we've had quite a lot of questions come in during that session. So the first question, in fact, Inez, we had a question earlier on. It would be nice if you could build on that. Someone was asking about the state of preservation of silk and clothing fabric. Do you see those in the environmental team?
It's very rare, but it sometimes happens. So I think somebody mentioned as well in contact with metal. So yeah, that's another type of mineralization. It's in contact with bronze or copper or iron objects, and that's the most common way of finding textiles in archaeology. So for example, attached to a buckle.
Thank you. Jessica is asking, and I think Jenny, this is one for you. Why exactly are the hazelnuts kept in water? Would it not be better for us to take them out of water? So why do we keep them in water?
I think that would probably be best for Ines.
So yeah, because they have been preserved in water, if we suddenly dry them, they will probably break into small fragments and certainly shrivel. So the best way is to keep them as they were found, as Jenny said. And yeah, it's also water and also cool temperature and dark environment, so it doesn't allow to grow mold on it.
And Dylan is asking, and I don't think we'll have a definite answer for this, but I'm sure we'll all have our own opinions. Were the hazelnuts stored and then forgotten, or were they a ritual deposit? What do we think?
Oh, that's a great question. We don't know really, but yeah, could be any of those. It's possible. We find hazelnuts in Neolithic sites very frequently, and they might be ritual possibly. This is something that I'm going to discuss later in my talk at 2 o'clock, so I recommend that you tune in because I have lots of hazelnuts in that talk.
And Emma, I know you like good ritual deposits. What do you reckon?
We'd have to know what was surrounding it, if there's any other clues and indications. It can be quite enticing, can't it, to think about ritualized deposits, but we'd hope to have more clues. But definitely tune in to Inez's talk later on this afternoon for more answers. And Inez, Imi is asking, can the seeds we find tell us about the diet of Bronze Age Saxon ancient people? If we find it in special deposits, we know it's gone through the digestive system, but otherwise, how do we prove that people are eating stuff just because we find the seed, or do we just
that's a very good question as well. Yeah, so it all depends on the context, but as well it's always open to interpretation. So that's one of the things in archaeology. We are never certain that we know all the facts. Yeah, so for example, if we find a very pure deposit of a single species of seed, we can guess that the likely explanation is that it was stored for being cooked, or it was being cooked and it was accidentally carbonized. It depends on it was preserved as well. Sometimes we might find deposits within bodies that have been preserved, like for example in peat bogs, and that's certainly a very good way of telling that, yeah, it was actually eaten as food. Also, if we find them in containers that were used for food processing, again, lots of interpretations are possible.
And Emma, this one for you. In the slides we showed earlier, Joshua is asking the initial sites we talked about where we had the GPR data on screen. What site was that? You know offhand? Yeah, so the first site we had with the pits, that's our Coleshill site. The second site that we had with the kind of coloured in circles on those nice shapes, that was a site called River Leam. That was a large mitigation site. I think, yeah, does that cover it? Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you very much. Have any of you, this is a question from Anne. Anne is asking, have any of you ever found beeswax? I haven't. No. Would it survive? I don't know.
It would survive in certain conditions, I guess in waterlogged deposits, but we haven't been lucky to find it, in, at least in my experience in Wessex.
One to look out for in the future. And more questions about hazelnuts. They've certainly captured everyone's imagination. But we do find that. I know, Jenny, when we're at events, people do certainly enjoy looking at the hazelnuts. Were the carbonised hazelnuts originally cooked, or were they just heated to remove the shells? Interesting. Can you know?
Please tune in at 2 o'clock for my talk, because I'm really going to discuss that. Yeah, both questions, both options are possible.
Perfect. That's really good. Thank you. Does anyone else have any extra questions? Oh, an interesting one. This is from Peter. Can DNA be recovered from the poo? I don't know.
Yes, it can. Yeah. So in poo, it would be a bit of complicated thing, because it would be the DNA of potentially the things that have been eaten, but also the animal that has produced the poo. But yeah, it's certainly been done. And yeah, we can find DNA in several types of remains, but it depends really on the condition. So it's likely to be found in deposits that haven't been disturbed for a long time. So for example, if something has been carbonized, but then reworked in the sediment, it will probably have been destroyed.
And Tom from Australia, thanks for coming in from Australia, Tom, that's fantastic. Tom is asking about, can you tell if the animals had any diseases by looking at their bones? And I can answer that one. Yes, Tom, you can tell, and it works for human bone as well. This has been quite widely written about, and if you look on our website, there's quite a lot of case studies where we've looked at human remains as well as animal remains and the diseases that people were suffering from. Things like syphilis show up particularly well on the skeleton. So there's plenty of stuff on our website if you want to have a look at that on the Wessex Archaeology website. Another question from Imi. Imi's asking, do we find some types of seeds are found more in certain areas around the country? Inez, do you want to?
Yes. Yes. For example, there are seeds associated to different parts of the country and as well different periods. So, for example, in the early medieval periods, we might find lots of wheat, but in the late medieval period and also in the north of the country, we might find rye and oats that were cultivated there more frequently than in the south, for example.
Thank you. A couple of people are asking if the talk will be available online. Yes, it will. So it will be available on both the CBA YouTube channel and the Wessex Archaeology YouTube channel later in the week. We'll get that up later in the week. Kimberly is asking, how difficult is it to separate artifacts from different periods that may have been mixed up by natural or human effects? And can we tell?
I suppose typology is one, isn't it? For like different, yeah.
Yeah, so we can.
Yeah.
So on a recent site, we had a large array of Romano-British field systems. So when I say field system, it's just a series of ditches that demarcate the landscape for agriculture and pasture. We know they're Romano-British because of the pottery that was found in them. However, in one of the samples we found a bit of Neolithic flint. So it's quite strange that to have something from that date all the way into a Roman date. So from there, it goes to the specialist. The specialist knows what deposit is in, what context, the surrounding kind of features nearby, and from there you can basically connect all the dots and see that that bit of Neolithic flint was intrusive and it's probably been brought in by the plough. However, it's still very important to note that it could be that those earlier prehistoric remains were truncated by later processes, so therefore that little flint is just a whisper of what was there prior to the Roman occupation in that area. So you can tell when things are what I would say intrusive, but they are still very important in giving us suggestions of what was there in those past landscapes.
And talking about intrusion, Lucy is asking, do we often find seeds which aren't native to the UK? And Lucy, I know the first thing we'll say is tune in at 2 o'clock for Inez's talk on that, because Inez will be talking very much about things that have come into the UK. But as a top level overview, Inez, is that a yes?
Yes, we sometimes find things, and it's quite exciting because we don't always know when things were first introduced in the country. But also we sometimes can have disappointments. So for example, not very long ago, we were studying a wreck and it was from the 16th century and we found a kiwi seed, and the kiwi seed, the kiwi is not a plant native to the UK, it's basically native to the Southeast Asia region. And we were quite excited because it was a very early discovery of that plant for the first time in the UK, but actually we radiocarbon dated and it was intrusive. So we need to be careful. We always radiocarbon things that are suspicious.
Brilliant. And our final question for the morning is from Holly. And Holly's question is, how can you tell what snail is what? Do we tell it from stratigraphy, or can we identify snails by the type of shell?
So, well, with snails, as well as with any other environmental remain, we have a comparative collection of reference material, so basically modern material of which we know the species, and then we compare our archaeological specimens with them. So that's the case for snails, but as well for seeds or charcoal or anything else, bones as well, obviously.
Thank you very much, Inez, and thank you everyone for all your questions. Now we're coming towards the end of the session. My colleagues and I are going to turn off our webcams now. I've got some questions for you on behalf of the Council for British Archaeology. So you're going to see on your screen very shortly a poll will pop up, and we've got a couple of questions to ask you. So firstly, we'd like to know how would you rate your level of enjoyment of your session this morning? So 1 is very, very low and 5 is very high. So give us an honest opinion, and this will help us work out if we've said the right thing, if this has been useful for you, and if we should do more of this sort of thing in the future. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to get your votes in. Thank you very much for voting. That's great. Okie dokie. And the next question we want to ask you is, did you learn something new today? So did you learn something new? I certainly did. Or did you not learn anything? And again, I'll give you a couple of seconds just to answer those questions. Marvellous. Thank you very much indeed. Time for a final vote. Perfect. Thank you very much. And my final question for you today is, would you take part in a Festival of Archaeology event in the future? Marvellous. Thank you very, very much indeed. So it just remains for me to say a massive thank you for joining us this morning. It's a beautiful day, so thank you for staying in and joining us for our session this morning. There's stacks of events going on this week, so head over to the festival website at festival.archaeologyuk.org to take part in some of the other events that are coming up this week. If you want to make a donation to the festival, there's a link on the screen below. If you're interested in hearing from Wessex Archaeology and the CBA about upcoming events, can you type a big yes into the questions box? And if you put a big yes in the question box now, we know that it's okay to contact you and tell you about future events that we've got coming up. I can see a whole bunch of you are putting a big yes in the box. I just want to say a special thank you to everyone who's joined us from Australia, South Africa and Canada today. That's a fantastic reach. So thank you so much for joining us. The session will be available in whole on our YouTube channels towards the end of next week. And don't forget, if we've sparked your interest this morning, we have an in-depth talk at 2 p.m. this afternoon on the domestication of plants and new discoveries about the first cereals in Britain with Inez, who you met a moment ago, and you can sign up for that on the festival website. So many thanks indeed, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Goodbye.